Today we're going to focus on the 1960s, specifically the administrations of John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Baines Johnson. So if you'd like to follow along, this is the Kennedy and Johnson years. Okay, so in 1960, John F. Kennedy is elected president. Um, this is seen as a great triumph for liberalism. Uh, One historian called Kennedy's way of doing things the politics of expectation. This is the triumph of the liberal consensus. It's a great period of liberal reform, probably the greatest period since the New Deal. You have civil rights, Medicare, the Great Society, and the war on poverty. That happens during the 1960s, but fast forward to 1968, and this liberal consensus is in disarray. John F. Kennedy, Robert F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King Jr. have all been killed. Lyndon Johnson does not seek re-election. There's a huge riot at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. The police beat protesters up out in the streets. Politicians fight amongst each other in the convention hall. So the 1960s starts out great for liberalism, and it kind of ends in disarray, and we'll kind of talk about that today. Now, the 1960 election is between Vice President Richard Nixon and Senator John F. Kennedy. They both had similar backgrounds. They're both born in the 20th century. They both served in the Navy during World War II. They were both elected to Congress in 1946. They're both elected to the Senate in the early 1950s. Both are known as anti-communist crusaders. Both of them were really involved in fighting communism. They also have not so similar backgrounds. JFK, he's the son of a wealthy businessman. His grandfather was ambassador to England. He attended Harvard. Kind of had the best life you could imagine as far as like wealth and privilege. Nixon is the son of a poor father. He struggles to survive. He had to sacrifice some of his schooling to help his family get by. He could have gone on to a very prestigious college, but he had to attend a local, cheaper college to kind of help the family out. Nixon's probably one of the most intellectual presidents we've ever had. He had a pretty good mind. Now, what's interesting about the 1960 election is that it's the first presidential election with televised debates. There's 4 debates, 70 million people watch. The debates don't go well for Nixon on TV. He had been in the hospital previously. He's looks really exhausted for his first debate. He refuses to wear makeup. And Kennedy, completely the opposite. Kennedy had been campaigning. He looks really tan and healthy. If you listened to the debate on the radio, pollsters found that you thought Nixon won. If you watched the debate on TV, pollsters found that you believed Kennedy won. So basically, we're kind of entering the age where politics is kind of a glamorous, almost has a movie star appeal. You know, people kind of tend to go for the most handsome or the most beautiful person. If you want to watch some clips, you can click on that. JFK wins a very narrow election, 49.7% to 49.5%, just over 100,000 votes separate them. Many historians think that the election was stolen in favor of Kennedy. Mayor Richard Daley, he's the Democratic mayor in Chicago. Kind of magically enough votes show up in Chicago to help JFK carry Illinois. There were also some questions about what happened in Texas. Lyndon Johnson is from Texas, so there might have been some shenanigans going on there. In JFK's inauguration, he famously said, "Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country." He kind of brings in the best and the brightest. Robert McNamara serves as Secretary of Defense. His younger brother, Robert Kennedy, serves as his Attorney General. Now, JFK's foreign policy is something called flexible response. Basically, it's a defensive policy in which the U.S. can have either a nuclear or conventional response to any crisis of communist aggression around the world. Eisenhower's new look had focused on nuclear weapons and was therefore cost effective. JFK's flexible response requires a lot more money because you're also building up your conventional force. He said the United States must be prepared to deter all wars, general or limited, nuclear or convention, large or small. So JFK is a cold warrior. He wants to fight communist aggression around the world, And when he was a senator, he kind of traveled the world talking about or learning about ways that the United States could support anti-communists around the world. So his first big policy, foreign policy venture, does not go well. This is the Bay of Pigs invasion. The communist Fidel Castro had taken over Cuba in 1959. He nationalizes billions of dollars in American assets. Eisenhower had started a plan to overthrow him. Remember, Eisenhower had overthrown communist leaning governments in Iran and Guatemala. JFK gets into office and gives the green light to this Bay of Pigs invasion. Um, what ends up happening is in April of 1961, Cuban exiles, this is not an American forces led invasion. These are anti communist Cubans who have fled Cuba and they kind of form an army. They invade Cuba in April of 1961. It's a disaster. The communists are ready for them. JFK refuses to give them air support. Many would criticize him for this. So the invasion's a disaster. Everybody is either killed or captured. So JFK's got egg on his face starting out in his administration early on. JFK does initiate some new ways of kind of thinking during the Cold War. He starts some agencies that kind of fight the Cold War in ways other than with the military. One example is the Peace Corps. Basically, volunteers would travel around teaching English or building wells in villages, kind of just helping people out with poverty. So there's an angle of helping the less fortunate, but it also shows that America's on their side during the Cold War. Something at the State Department called the Agency for International Development is started. This is just foreign aid to the third world. There's a Food for Peace program. He had something called the Alliance for Progress. It's a 10-year plan for the Americas. Basically, billions of dollars are invested in Latin America to stimulate their economies. Kind of think along the lines of the Marshall Plan. You know, if we can save Europe from communism by rebuilding their economies, maybe we can help Latin America fend off communism by kind of building up their countries. JFK goes to meet Khrushchev in June of 1961 in Vienna. This is the Vienna Summit. Khrushchev respected Eisenhower. Eisenhower's a military man. Here you got this young guy. He's almost like a movie star, become president. Khrushchev does not respect Kennedy. Khrushchev walks all over JFK. He bullies him at the summit, sees him as a weak president. JFK admits privately that basically, you know, Khrushchev walked all over me. I didn't know what to do with him. So at first, Khrushchev doesn't respect JFK, but that'll change over time because of things that happen in Berlin and Cuba. Now, one of the biggest crises during the Cold War is Berlin. Basically, you have a capitalist and a communist society right next to each other, so it's a really good test case to see what's better, capitalism or communism, socialism. And many German citizens realize this. One German citizen said all you had to do was board a subway or a surface train, and you were in another world. You could go from socialism to capitalism in 2 minutes. Other German or Soviet officials talked about how Berlin basically presents a problem because the socialists can see how successful the capitalists are. So I've got some quotes up here you can read, kind of talking about that. Now, in 1958, when Eisenhower is still president, Khrushchev issues an ultimatum. He threatens to end the four-power joint occupation of Berlin. He gives the Allies a set amount of time, an ultimatum to kind of figure this out. Khrushchev famously says something like, all I have to do is squeeze Berlin and it makes the West jump. He calls Berlin the testicles of the West. So he knows Berlin is a pressure point. But Berlin is also a problem for the Soviet Union. Millions of people are leaving East Germany and fleeing to West Germany. So basically, you have the best and the brightest people, the doctors, the philosophers, the engineers, the teachers, people that can leave are leaving East Germany. They're fleeing it, and they're losing millions of people. By the end of 1961, almost more than 2.5 million people had fled East Germany, and they do this through West Berlin. If you're East German, you can go to West Berlin and get your passport arranged so that you can go to West Germany, and then you're free, basically. Um, so what ends up happening is Khrushchev realizes he has to stop people from leaving East Germany, so he starts to build the Berlin Wall. And if you look at slide 23, I've got a video clip. I'd like you to watch that. It's a newsreel. It kind of shows you stuff about the Berlin Wall, but it's barbed wire at first, and then it turns into concrete. Khrushchev admitted, he said, the wall was a hateful thing, but what should I have done? More than 30,000 people, in fact, the best and most qualified people from the GDR, left the country in July. The East German economy would have collapsed if we hadn't done something soon against the mass flight, so the wall was the only remaining option. JFK responds by saying, we never had to put up a wall to keep our people in, to prevent them from leaving us. So the Berlin Wall kind of shows that socialism, communism is not as good as capitalism. Eventually, JFK sends in troops into West Berlin. LBJ and General Lucius Clay go to Berlin to kind of show their solidarity. Russian and American tanks face each other across East and West Berlin. JFK goes there later on and gives a famous speech in Berlin. You can kind of see the picture of the tanks kind of standing off against each other. The other big crisis of JFK's presidency is the Cuban Missile Crisis. Basically, Castro is fearful that the United States will invade, so he wants protection. So he seeks aid from the Soviet Union. Russia agrees to put missiles in Cuba to protect Castro from invasion. In July of 1962, Soviet ships with nuclear missiles and 40,000 soldiers arrived in Cuba. Later that year, in October, a U-2 spy plane takes photos over Cuba, and analysts realize that there are missile sites being built in Cuba. Basically, Khrushchev said, I'm protecting Castro in Cuba, and I also want to spread communism in Latin America. Basically, if you have a superpower backing you, maybe the communists will feel more confident in kind of fomenting revolution. Khrushchev also wants to rebalance, lost the word I'm looking for. He wants to create a balance of power. Basically, the United States has lots of missiles in Europe, in Italy, in Britain, and then eventually in Turkey. These missiles can reach Russia very quickly. If Russia wants to bomb the United States, it's going to take a while. Their missiles, their bombers will take longer to get there. So basically, Khrushchev wants to reestablish the balance of power. So if these missiles can be put in Cuba, the United States will be just as threatened as the Soviet Union would be. And I've got some pictures you can kind of see of the missile sites. So what ends up happening is Kennedy learns the missiles are on Cuba in October of 1962. All the American major cities are in range of the Soviet nuclear missiles. What should America do? Basically, he has different options. He could strike them from the air with the military. He could invade Cuba. He could quarantine Cuba. Or he could just kind of try to wait and see what happens. Khrushchev refuses to back down. There's a confrontation in the United Nations. Basically, what JFK decides to do is he decides to impose a blockade of Cuba. So the American Navy is going to surround Cuba and prevent any more weapons from getting there. That's seen as the best option. The military really wanted to go in and bomb the missile sites before they were operational. These missile sites aren't quite ready to launch missiles, so the military is thinking if we can get in there before they're operational, we can wipe them out, and then there's no threat. If we wait till they're operational, there will be a threat. So there's some tense moments in the blockade. The Americans stop a Russian oil tanker at one point. Khrushchev realizes that JFK is serious. This is when Khrushchev, I think, starts to gain some respect for Kennedy. Khrushchev contacts Kennedy kind of through back channels and says, we're like two men pulling on a rope with a knot in the middle. The more we pull, the tighter it will get until only a sword will be able to get the knot out. Why don't we let up a little? So basically, JFK and Khrushchev come to an agreement. There's basically three components. Russia agrees to take the missiles and soldiers out of Cuba. JFK promises he won't invade Cuba and overthrow Castro. That's publicly stated. Secretly, JFK promises to take offensive missiles out of Turkey. So there's some missiles recently been put in Turkey. He's going to remove these, but he keeps this part a secret. So if you're just an average citizen, it looks like Kennedy kind of won this battle. He looked pretty tough, but secretly he promised to give Khrushchev a little bit more. JFK and Khrushchev also, this whole instance creates the establishment of a hotline, basically so Washington and Moscow can talk to each other anytime they need to. JFK gives a speech at the American University in June of 1963, and he says he wants to curb nuclear arms and he wants a test ban treaty. And basically, what ends up happening is because of the kind of threat of nuclear war, you do get a partial nuclear test ban treaty in 1963. So the Americans and the Soviets are starting to kind of realize they might need to dial down the Cold War a little bit. Domestic policy, JFK's kind of domestic agenda is called the New Frontier. He focuses on the economy, on civil rights, education, healthcare, the space program. Now, on civil rights, he doesn't really do much. JFK doesn't really have a strong civil rights record. That will come kind of later with his successors. He cuts taxes, increases military spending, increases space exploration. He's the one that eventually put a man on the moon, even though that happened after he had already been assassinated. And on November 22nd, 1963, JFK is assassinated while in Dallas. His vice president, Lyndon Johnson, takes over. And if you want, you can watch the video that kind of compares JFK to Lincoln. It's kind of a conspiracy theory, kind of a strange video, but it's kind of interesting. Lyndon Johnson takes over. He uses JFK's death to push for civil rights and liberal reforms. The 1964 Civil Rights Act is passed. The 1965 Voting Rights Act is passed. Now, Lyndon Johnson opposed civil rights throughout the 1950s while he was a senator from Texas. But when he becomes president, he switches his position. He infamously says about signing legislation to help blacks who he had always opposed. He said, I'll have these N-words voting Democrat for the next 200 years. So whether or not Lyndon Johnson believed in civil rights or whether he just saw this as a new voting bloc that he could kind of capture, that's kind of up for debate. His domestic agenda is really what becomes the greatest reform since the New Deal. His Great Society is kind of this massive war on poverty. He has Medicare, which is health care for the elderly, Medicaid, health care for the poor. So LBJ, great New Deal reformer. He actually started out in Congress kind of during the New Deal in the 1930s, so he's a New Deal Democrat. You can see a picture there of him shaking FDR's hand. As a congressman, he worked to get federal money to farmers and schools. He funded public libraries and roads. He fights for funding for the Great Dam on the Colorado River, electricity to people in Texas, rural farmers who can't afford electricity. He is an opponent of civil rights. Like I said, spends most of his life fighting against civil rights. In 1941, he runs for Senate. He has the election stolen from him. He probably won this election, but there was some vote stealing going on. Later on, he runs for the Senate again, and he realizes this time the way to win in Texas is to make sure you win. So in this election, he might have cheated a little bit to kind of get what he deserved in the previous election. He traveled around in a helicopter, speaking all over Texas. He wins by 87 votes, and these were probably false votes that his political crony supplied. Because he won by 87 votes, he starts getting called Landslide Lyndon, kind of a joke. You know, he barely won. He probably cheated, so we'll call him Landslide Lyndon. He becomes the majority leader in the Senate after the 1954 elections. He becomes one of the most powerful senators ever. Like I said, after Kennedy died, he really used Kennedy's death to get a lot of reforms passed. And in 1964, Lyndon Johnson has to run for election himself. He runs against the Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater. I want you to watch the campaign ad on slide 68. It's called the Daisy ad. Basically, what happens is Lyndon Johnson runs as the peace candidate, and he labels Barry Goldwater as an extremist who's going to get everybody killed in a nuclear war. Um, there's also stuff going on in Vietnam, which we'll kind of get into later on. LBJ was really worried about Barry Goldwater. He said, "My biggest fear is that Barry Goldwater will make me look soft on communism and blame me for losing Vietnam to the communists." And that's kind of what the Republicans did to Truman when China fell to the communists. Um, Barry Goldwater is a really interesting person. He's a very libertarian sort of politician. He's kind of seen as the first conservative, real conservative to kind of like run for president. Um, Although he's not conservative on a number of issues, he's more libertarian. When he's giving his one of his campaign speeches, he famously says, "Tolerance in the face of tyranny is no virtue. Extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice." Um, People used to have bumper stickers that said, "In your heart, you know he's right." So people that supported Goldwater said that. But then people that oppose Goldwater would say, "In your head, you know he's crazy." Um, he said things like, maybe we should use tactical nuclear weapons to defeat communists if we need to. So he's very harsh on his rhetoric towards communism. Now, Lyndon Johnson's also anti-communist, but Johnson kind of runs as the peace candidate. A young Ronald Reagan gives a speech supporting Barry Goldwater. This kind of catapults Ronald Reagan onto the national stage. We'll talk a lot about him later. If you look at slide 73, you can see Goldwater gets annihilated in the general election. LBJ gets over 60% of the vote. The reason this happened is Goldwater is painted as an extremist who will get us in nuclear war. LBJ promises not to get us dragged into a conflict in Vietnam. So Goldwater wins Arizona, and then he wins 5 southern states. Now, this is kind of ironic. Lyndon Johnson spent his whole life opposing civil rights. But then all of a sudden in the 1960s, he flipped and he decides to support civil rights. So he signs the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act. Barry Goldwater had supported civil rights his whole life. He supported anti-discrimination laws in Arizona. He works with the NAACP. Barry Goldwater is very pro-civil rights. But Barry Goldwater opposes the Civil Rights Act because he thinks that it makes the federal government too powerful. So he doesn't support it, or he doesn't oppose it, sorry. He doesn't oppose it because he's against civil rights. He just thinks that's the wrong way to get civil rights. Lyndon Johnson probably supported the Civil Rights Act, not because he truly believed in it, but because he saw blacks as a new voting bloc that he could really tap into. And that might be a little too critical of Johnson. I think later in his life he really did believe in civil rights, but Johnson's a very calculated politician. He knows when to switch sides to get votes. I think Barry Goldwater is too much of a purist. He won't switch sides to get votes, and you can see that that really screwed him up in the election. But Goldwater gets trounced. Domestic policy, Johnson pours a ton of money into education. He pours a ton of money into healthcare. He beautifies the highways. Highways used to be really trashy, so Congress passes the Highway Beautification Act, kind of cleaning up America's roads. The Immigration Act of 1965 abandons the quota system, so immigration is open to more countries than just kind of European-based countries. He shores up the New Deal. He broadens Social Security. He creates more public housing and creates food stamps. He pumps a bunch of money into the economy. The Economic Opportunity Act has all kinds of programs to try to help the needy: Head Start, Job Corps, Upward Bound, Vista. Johnson grew up in poverty, so that's kind of his main focus. Now, what ends up happening is, we'll talk about Vietnam in another lecture, but Vietnam ends up killing the Great Society. Lyndon Johnson famously said, "That bitch of a war killed the lady I really loved, the Great Society." So basically, Johnson really wanted to focus on domestic affairs, but because of the Vietnam War, he kind of got dragged into world affairs. And we'll talk more about that when we get to the Vietnam War.